to this point, we have been reviewing the period that led up to the Great Crash, the 20s, the not-so-roaring 20s, I call them, some of the causes that may have led to the crash, and we've dealt with Herbert Hoover, a great humanitarian, a great engineer, trying to cope with it, being bewildered, as it were. Started out as one of the most popular men in the country, turned out at the end of the term, he was one of the most reviled persons in the country. But all of that is really merely a prelude, a preface to the remarkable colossus of a figure who followed, a titan who dominated the landscape of our country for 12 of our most trying years, from his inauguration in 1933 in March to his death in April 1945. A figure like perhaps none in our history other than Washington or Lincoln. A figure so venerated, so revered, that upon his death in 1945, the entire nation felt as if it had been orphaned, that we had lost a father, a guardian. Grown men cried. We had lost someone who would see us through our deepest trials, our most profound ordeals by fire, the Great Depression, the Second World War. He had become the platform upon which our way of life stood. For 12 long years, he had been there, ubiquitous, dominating our lives. So there was no television, there was no Facebook, no internet, no Twitter, and few had actually seen him up close in person. They'd seen him from a distance. And remarkably, virtually the whole nation was unaware that he couldn't even walk, and that he was confined to a wheelchair, and yet his visage was impressed upon our minds as perhaps no other in history. Yet, did Roosevelt really cure anything? That's the subject of today's talk. In a gripping description of the pending disaster as Roosevelt took office in March of 1933, Newsweek editor Jonathan Alder, in a recent book called The Defining Moment, describes some of the darkest days of the 20th century. As Roosevelt took office, 25% of our populace was officially unemployed, but non-farm unemployment was 37%. And don't tell the people in Toledo, Ohio, it was only 25% or 37%. In Toledo, Ohio, in the heart of the Rust Belt, near where I was born, it was 80%. Millions of personal bank accounts had been closed, wiped out through bank failures. Armed men patrolled the entrances to the White House, to federal buildings, with machine gunners perched on the roofs of federal buildings. Nebraska State House was occupied by 4,000 men. Seattle County Office Building by 6,000 men. Bankruptcies were disrupted by armed men. The eminent columnist Walter Lippmann reportedly told FDR, "The situation is critical, Franklin. You may have no alternative but to assume dictatorial powers." This is Walter Lippmann, one of the great rational liberal columnists of the time. The New York Herald Tribune, a rival of the New York Times, ran a headline, quote, "For dictatorship if necessary." Perhaps more frightening of all, Alder discovered a recent draft of an unused speech prepared by the White House staff for delivery by FDR, right after he was inaugurated, to a battle-scarred veterans group. It was never given, fortunately, but it had FDR astoundingly announcing, quote, "I reserve to myself the right to command you in any phase of the situation which may now confront us," i.e., ready to take dictatorial power. We'll deal with that issue next week, why he didn't become a dictator. Soon the word dictator at that time, however, would carry sinister tones, later in the 30s, but not then. Mussolini was admired in this country at the time. He had made the trains run on time. So we come to the first 100 days. It had rained in Washington for the 2 weeks prior to FDR's inauguration in March, but on the day of his inauguration, the sky cleared. Many felt it was an omen from God. In his inaugural address, following the now famous phrase, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself," FDR proclaimed into a chill March wind, "This nation requires action, and action now." And action he gave them. What followed was a blizzard of activity perhaps unparalleled in our history. University professor and brain truster Rexford Tugwell labeled it a Renaissance spring, a time of rebirth in a dark age. And anything can be done spirit suddenly permeated the hitherto gloomy marble halls of our federal buildings. FDR enlisted and brought to Washington an exciting group of dedicated young intellectuals, mostly young. He infused them with a spirit of service to our country, perhaps unrivaled until the youthful charisma of the JFK years. Many of us remember those quite well. And they created a bewildering amalgam of acronyms. Many launched during the 3 months immediately following inauguration, a period which has come to be known as the first 100 days, a sort of a honeymoon period which since Roosevelt has sort of been granted to almost every president that comes in. But at that time, it was a totally bipartisan spirit. It wasn't just a honeymoon, it was a love fest. And of course, the explosion of acronyms that followed came to be known as the New Deal. What happened to the acronyms that first exploded onto the scene in March 1933? Well, of many of those FDR created, a number were wildly successful, but only for a while. Others were successful in part, but highly controversial. Some were abject failures. A number were ruled unconstitutional. Others became a permanent part of our daily lives, and we can't imagine living without them. What is clear, however, is that none of them cured the economic depression. But what did change and begin to heal almost from the start was the spiritual depression of our nation. Something was at last being done. FDR had an electrifying impact on the psyche of our people, and something else began to happen. For there gradually emerged from the ashes of the Depression a new moral atmosphere, which, though controversial, embedded itself forever in the life of our polity, and in one form or another shapes our lives even today. I'm going to very briefly explore 3 of those acronyms. I don't have time to go through all of them. There were dozens. One of the successful acronyms which faded from the scene before the end of the Depression, the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps. An abject failure, the NIRA, National Industrial Recovery Act, and its agency, the National Recovery Administration, the NRA. And WPA, Works Project Administration, in particular, the Federal One Arts Program, created during the so-called Second New Deal, which was successful in a number of respects, but ultimately proved highly controversial. The permanent fixtures which are a part of our lives and our household words today, you can give them to me, include such agencies and programs as FICA, Social Security. We can't imagine having lived without that. The FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which insures our bank accounts. The SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, and of course FEMA, the Emergency Management Administration. There are, of course, numerous other acronyms, but though the acronyms themselves are important historically, they're not my main focus here. Most important, we'll conclude with a consideration of the metamorphosis of soul, which our nation underwent under Roosevelt. Call it the intangible catharsis which FDR wrought. But before the acronyms came the banking decree. On Sunday night, March 5th, 1933, immediately after he was inaugurated, FDR informed the nation by administrative decree that the next 4 days were to be declared holidays for all banks and financial institutions. He explained that this would permit an examination of their soundness. Of course, the word holiday was merely a euphemism to replace the more dour Hoover term moratorium. banking decree had immediate ramifications. Imagine the atmosphere which preceded it. From 1930 to 32, a total of 3,604 state banks had failed, taking with them over $2 billion in deposits. Chaos reigned. There were rumors of a national disaster. The total lack of confidence in the banking system had resulted in a wave upon wave of withdrawals by people from the banks. The Treasury Department estimated an enormous amount of money, well over $2 billion had been withdrawn from circulation. That time, a very, very large amount of money. There was some confusion over FDR's banking decree, and the explanation for what was in that decree fell upon a fellow by the name of William H. Wooden, a very diminutive man who sort of reminds me when I see his picture of Mr. Whipple of the Charmin commercial. Remember him? Don't squeeze the Charmin. He was a very diminutive guy who was actually, this fellow Wooden, Treasury Secretary, mistaken for a button salesman and denied entrance to the White House at one time. But it fell to his lot, unfortunately, to explain this very difficult event. Well, what could be done? Well, the banks could make small change. They could take a $10 bill and convert it into $1 bills. They could make a loan for food. You could get at your safety deposit box. So if you've been fortunate enough to stash away a lot of money in a safe deposit box, you could get at it. That you could do. You could cash a check drawn on the U.S. government, but there weren't many of those. Didn't have Social Security then. And that's all. No other checks could be cashed. Postal money orders, yeah, you could draw those if you had the money to go buy a postal money order, but who did? But nothing else, no withdrawals. Imagine that situation. Imagine yourself in that situation. No ATM, can't cash a check, you can't withdraw money, you're stuck. Either you have it or you don't. And if you don't have it before that decree goes into effect, you've had it. Well, Roosevelt realized that most important was movement, any movement in the short run. And he was, one of his modus operandis was he would try anything, do anything. And if it doesn't work, stop and go on to something else, quite unlike Hoover, who was rigid and stayed with it and couldn't admit if something didn't work. Totally the reverse here. Ironically, his first forays were conservative ones. One of the first things he adopted was the emergency banking decree. He always tried to keep his opponents off balance that way. So it was that the major push for reform during the first 100 days actually proceeded during FDR's first week by a move that Herbert Hoover would not only have approved, but would have cheered. Now on that subject, Roosevelt had steadfastly refused to cooperate with Hoover during the interregnum from November 1932 to March 1933. And that's why Hoover was so dour during the inauguration, the ride to the inauguration ceremony. There were cartoons about it in the New Yorker and pictures of Hoover with a very dour expression on his face and Roosevelt waving to the crowd and smiling and all. The Emergency Banking Relief Act provided assistance to private bankers, and that was actually adopted immediately. It's something that Hoover would have loved. But ironically, FDR rejected the one measure up front that would have had lasting effect, FDIC. It was not to his liking, believe it or not, at first. He was finally dragged to it, kicking and screaming, in June of that year. And of course, it proved one of the most important of the New Deal measures. The ironies surrounding the remedies adopted during this initial 4-day period following the inauguration are indeed intriguing. What I find most significant is a comment by brain truster Raymond Moley, and I want to read you that because it's described by author David Kennedy in a wonderful book, by the way, that you should read called Freedom from Fear about this period. Reminiscent of the situation that obtained in our nation's capital just when the Bush administration turned over the reins to the Obama administration. Quote, haunting the corridors of the Treasury Department day and night, private bankers, both old and new, toiled frantically to rescue the moribund corpse of American finance. In that hectic week, none led normal lives. Sound familiar? Moley remembered confusion, haste, the dread of making mistakes, the consciousness of responsibility for the economic well-being of millions of people made mortal inroads on the health of some of us and left the rest of us ready to snap at our own images in the mirror. And then this very important comment. Only Roosevelt, Moley observed, preserved the air of a man who'd found a happy way of life. Remember that. I found that image of FDR particularly compelling, and I'll return to that theme later. It's quite important in understanding Roosevelt. As author Robert McIlvaine noted, at last things were happening. Roosevelt had lifted the nation's morale. That was perhaps the view from the top. But from the bottom, he had not lifted my father's morale. My father anticipated that FDR would close the banks. In this, he was prescient, but not only for a holiday, but for good. It seemed, however, that all of the rest of Cleveland, Ohio, were prescient as well. My father was trying a case in the municipal court in Cleveland and said to my mother, Seal, here's a withdrawal slip, and go on down to the Guardian Trust Company on Euclid Avenue and withdraw all our money. Because I have a feeling, quite frankly, I'm feeling pretty sure about this, that the Guardian Trust is going to close its doors forever tomorrow. So women at that time, not a lot of them had bank accounts. They weren't necessarily involved in the finances of homes as they are, of course, now. And my mother was one of those. And she took the withdrawal slip and she took the rapid transit down Terminal Tower, walked up Euclid Avenue, and got to the Guardian Trust Company. Lo and behold, there was a line out the door all the way around the block to Superior Avenue. She got in the line. Other people had the same feeling. Well, about 3 hours later, she got to the head of the line, proffered the withdrawal slip, and the clerk said, oh, Mrs. Auerbach, that's a good deal of money. Will you take a bank check? She said, sure. He wrote a bank check out, gave it to her, and she took it right away, ran over to the municipal court to show my father she had a bank check. It was one of those pivotal marital moments. Thank God they both survived. Suffice it to say that my mother ran back to the Guardian Trust Company, got in line again, put the withdrawal, got that check, got up to the wicker window just before it closed, cashed that bank check, and saved our family finances, such as they were. From that point on, during the balance of the Depression, our Guardian Trust Company, our FDIC, was a black metal strongbox under the mattress in the bedroom. I still have that box as sort of remembrance of that period. The acronym CCC stood for Civilian Conservation Corps. It was most certainly FDR's favorite. It sprang directly out of his youth. As a gentleman farmer in upstate New York, James Roosevelt, his father, would often take young Franklin on trips through his estate, going through the beautiful landscape, past the greenhouse, the ice house, apple orchards, the vineyards, grain fields, beautiful lakes. And he imbued young Franklin with a love of the forestry and of the soil. And this was an image that remained in his mind all of his life. In fact, he was dreaming of it when he died in April 1945, just as the war seemed to be coming near a close. But James imbued Franklin with something else, equally as deep and equally as profound, and it came to define him. It was a sense of noblesse oblige, a social conscience that Eleanor would come to represent and reinforce much later in life, which Joseph Persico, in a recent book called Franklin and Lucy, describes. He tells of James Roosevelt as a youth visiting London, watching as a destitute family descended on a crude ladder below the sewer and gas lines of London into a dank hovel they occupied among the rats and vermin. He quotes James Roosevelt as exhorting, "Help the helpless. For the sake of our common humanity, it is for that single cause that we all have, all of us, one human heart." That's the background. Typically, young Franklin would be taken along in the family's carriage as food and clothing were distributed to the poor. A great sense of noblesse oblige. Later in life, when FDR first came to know Eleanor, she introduced him to the tenements of Lower East Side, New York. Now, Eleanor was a debutante. FDR dated debutantes. He was a handsome young man, very eligible bachelor, came from a good family, and he was humorous, very well spoken. He had his choice of the most beautiful debutantes of the time. And of course, he chose Eleanor. She was a rather gawky, tall woman, and not gorgeous, rather plain-faced, buck-toothed, but she had something that none of the others had. She brought him down to the tenements of the Lower East Side where she worked, and she gave him basically a social consent. She exposed him to that atmosphere. And she became an irrepressible and highly vocal advocate of common humanity in the White House during days when our nation's history was in the balance, when FDR was forced to make very pragmatic, hard choices, cruel, pragmatic decisions, life and death decisions on which the fate of the nation depended, and often eventually the fate of Western civilization as well, as we'll see later. And this highly moral sense of obligation, planted by James Roosevelt and later reinforced by Eleanor, this same uplifting spirit of service and restoring human dignity found its way into the CCC. The CCC took jobless youth, mostly from the inner cities, put them to work out on the farms, out in the forests of the country, building roads in many raw and settled sections of the far west, building dams, doing reforestation work, and building things such as the Palisades Parkway in New Jersey. Thousands of young men lined up in front of Army induction centers to file their applications and take physicals. For many Eastern City boys, this was their first experience with the West. Upon induction, they were immediately sent to Army camps, and from there to various state locations where they were housed in accommodations often built by their own hand. Many stayed. It was the most rewarding experience of their life, changed their lives. A large number of the CCC stayed on, a number of own ranches today, and stayed out in the West. Each enrollee was given $30 a month, which $25 was sent to his family. Preference was given, of course, to families on relief. By 1937, the CCC was a major government concern, owning over $100 million of equipment, and it had entered into many, many projects mapped out for years ahead. More than 2.5 million youths were enlisted in the CCC, and they were involved in 300 different forms of occupation throughout the country, running a gamut from building a dam on the Winooski River right here in Vermont to building a small pond at Yellowstone Park to protect a nest of trumpeter swans from predator animals such as coyotes. Many of you are probably familiar with some of the CCC projects or have ancestors or relatives that were involved. Shortly after the program was founded, the Bonus Expeditionary Army, remember them from last week, came back to Washington during the Roosevelt administration. Roosevelt did not send MacArthur to deal with the Bonus Expeditionary Army. He sent Eleanor, and Eleanor trudged out through mud and took sandwiches and coffee to those there and led them in the singing of It's a Long, Long Way to Tipperary. She also offered them jobs in the CCC, which 2,500 of them immediately accepted, and the Bonus Expeditionary Army dispersed. That's the difference between Roosevelt and Hoover. The CCC program which so satisfied the bonus army, lasted until the wartime draft in 1941. Of course, they were ready-made cadres for the military. These men were used to training, and they blended right into the military very quickly. They had actually planted 1,500 million trees during their lifetime, 3,500,000 check dams to control erosions, thousands of bird sanctuaries, and stocked thousands of streams with fish. Regrettably, none of this cured the economic depression. But far more important than the material benefits it bestowed on the nation was the mental, physical, and spiritual uplift that the CCC afforded the despondent youth of the Depression years. They arrived as behavioral problems. They left as role models. When they came, many were undernourished, illiterate, bitter, resentful, hostile. The majority became healthy, wholesome, gained basic educational skills, and they left upbeat and respectful. Most important of all, they regained their dignity. The program, which ultimately proved one of the most successful of the New Deal acronyms, admirably fulfilled FDR's dual goals of conserving both our natural and our human resources. Now let's talk about a failure, the NRA. The NRA was one of the great failures of the first 100 days. On June 16, 1933, FDR scrawled his signature on a piece of legislation he called, quote, the most important and far-reaching legislation ever enacted by the American Congress. Well, the National Industrial Recovery Act, he proclaimed, represents a supreme effort to stabilize, quote, for all time, the many factors which make for the prosperity of the nation. Quote, in short, it didn't. The NRA, which was envisioned as the centerpiece of FDR's cornucopia of acronyms, sought to stabilize overproduction, stem disastrous price cutting, and to eliminate starvation wages and terrible working conditions, at least for the fortunate few who still had a job. The legislation was broad and was sweeping and passed very quickly. But what it did is essentially gave the executive power to promote self-regulation by industry. Industry would decide how they wanted to regulate prices and wages, presumably with the aid of the labor representative and the industry representative, and then the government would incorporate that into regulations which could be enforced by the executive. Well, these were called codes of fair compliance. The man chosen to engineer this mammoth enterprise was a fellow by the name of General Hugh Johnson, a character dubbed Old Iron Pants by his staff. Old Iron Pants was a man who worked under Bernard Baruch in the War Industries Board in the First World War. Baruch, who was not consulted, had dubbed Johnson dangerous and unstable, but nobody consulted Bernie Baruch. In reality, the NRA was nothing more than glorified price and wage fixing by industry with a government approval. Something akin to it actually worked in Italy during the first years of Mussolini's administration there, and Mussolini, remember, was greatly admired at that time in this country. You remember the popular slogan, he made the trains run on time. He had. In keeping with Johnson's rather manic style, the NRA was launched with parades all over the country simultaneously. They were like programmed out of Busby Berkeley or something, out of Cecil B. DeMille. Thousands upon thousands of people marched down the streets carrying banners, "We do our part." Blue Eagle stickers, some of you may remember them, appeared everywhere. Automobiles and storefronts. Everybody, we do our part. It was the great hope this would bring us out of the Depression. It was at least something was being done. But we weren't fighting the Kaiser this time, we were fighting greed. And ironically, it was greed that brought the NRA down. General Johnson gave industries a rather free hand in adopting their own codes and then incorporated them into government-enforced regulations. The unfortunate result is the largest of the companies in the bulk of the 400 industries dominated the industry code groups. And although well-intentioned, the NRA became a bureaucracy run amok. We all know how that happens. There were eons of red tape and intrusive micromanagement from Washington. Staff of 4,500 churned out 13,000 pages of codes and 11,000 interpretive rulings. A hardware store, for example, faced 19 separate codes of compliance. Even burlesque show proprietors were regulated on how many times a night their strippers could take off their clothes. Believe it or not, they were actually regulating this. But unfortunately, the NRA did nothing to bring about economic recovery. Greed took over. As a result, the codes heavily favoring the manufacturers who dominated the board suspended competition and prices soared. Wages didn't keep pace. Then came the disillusionment. When the thousands upon thousands of people marched down the streets, they had great pie-in-the-sky hopes. Unfortunately, none came to fruition. By 1934, complaints of NRA prices and Hoover wages were common. The demagogues weighed in. Huey Long bastardized the NRA into national runaround. Hearst said it means no recovery allowed. There would be no redistribution of income, no stimulating of purchasing power. While this was happening, old Iron Pants was deteriorating right along with his program. He became an alcoholic, was often absent for long periods of time. Roosevelt finally had to get rid of him. He surfaced in 1938, denouncing Roosevelt as someone having a northern pro-Negro policy and supportive of Mussolini, who by that time was not held in great esteem in this country. Well, although it was not the intention of FDR or his advisors, the hastily enacted NIRA had within it the potential for fascism through government control of wages, prices, production, the workforce, and management. As Robert McFarlane astutely observed, however, the seeds of fascism never germinated in American soil. When business domination of the NRA became apparent, says McIlvaine, the program's popularity faded. When the Supreme Court in the Schechter Poultry case finally ruled that it was unconstitutional and did away with the NRA, Roosevelt feigned great concern about the Supreme Court, and we'll get into that next week when we get into the issue of court packing. But in point of fact, he privately confided to Francis Perkins, who's the first Secretary of Labor, you know, Francis, this whole thing is a mess. I think perhaps the NRA has done all it can do. And it faded into oblivion. The WPA, one of the most important of the New Deal acronyms was the Works Project Administration, came along in the second New Deal, 1935. Its genesis was in an executive order after the huge emergency relief appropriation of that year, which was intended by FDR to, quote, move people from relief to work, the maximum number of people in the shortest time possible. It was placed under the direction of Harry Hopkins, an advisor and the man perhaps closest of anyone to FDR. Many thought Hopkins might be his successor. Hopkins became quite ill, died prematurely. On the plus side, the WPA did construct and improve more than 20,000 playgrounds, public schools, airports, hospitals, LaGuardia Airport, for example, constructed by them. And it created and encouraged an arts program of remarkable and enduring quality, the federal-run program. But many came to feel that it was merely thinly disguised charity, a dole. The administration created enough make-work projects to lend some credence to this concept that one group of people would be shoveling out and digging a hole, and the others would simply be shoveling and putting it back in. So that many names came for the WPA, like We Poke Around, that sort of thing. Pay was woefully inadequate. Nationwide average was a mere $55, and Roosevelt purposely kept it that way. He didn't want people to become dependent on the dole. He wanted them to get in the WPA and then retain their dignity and then get out of the WPA as soon as possible. Well, that's the way it looked from the top. But from below, this policy often led to social disconnect. Here's an example. Kids are mean, we all know that. When I was in the 4th grade, the WPA was sneeringly referred to in our school. I was in a suburban school as We Poke Around. by other kids around us. Their fathers were gainfully employed. One kid's father, let's call him Curtis, was not gainfully employed. Curtis didn't dress like the other kids. He wore very shabby, mended, ill-fitting corduroy knickers, and he was also not one of the swiftest kids in the class. So when one day he allowed that his father was on the WPA, suddenly it started. And that suddenly, he had a father who, in the judgment of these kids, was just pretending to work while everybody else's father earned money to pay for this, money that everybody's father had to work for. So Curtis was unmercifully attacked, bullied, and referred to as a dunce, a clown. Only kids can be that mean. I felt sorry for him. I was not one of his close friends, but I felt sorry for him, and I went to bat for him. I stood up for him. I got bloodied plenty, and I bloodied plenty, and eventually it calmed down. It stopped. Kids will get over things like that. But things got better, and Curtis remembered. Now, one day Curtis said, look, hey, why don't you come over to my house to play? I said, sure. So I went. I sort of wondered what his house was like. Well, I got to his house. It was just like any other house. Looked like my house, the house next door, just a wonderful house. So we went up to his room to play with his toys, and suddenly I saw something there. I said, wait a minute, you got 5 decoders here. You know what decoders are? And well, you know, there were radio programs in those days. They were serials. One was Tom Mix and his Ralston Straight Shooters. There was Jack Armstrong, the All-American Boy. There was Little Orphan Annie. And they all had products. Ralston for Tom Mix, Wheaties for Jack Armstrong, Ovaltine for Little Orphan Annie. I listened to them all. And they had the phenomenon of the box top. Some young, bright guy on Madison Avenue had discovered the box top. If you got kids to accumulate enough of these box tops and mail them in, they could get all kinds of things, gliders, even BB guns at one point, games, and most important at all, secret decoders. If you had a secret decoder, you were part of the elite. You were part of the cognoscente, okay? You were special. But I couldn't get one of those. I was an only child. I could only eat so much cereal. And every time I got the damn box tops up to this point where I could get them, well, they no longer offered it. My problem. So Curtis brought me up to his room, and I saw 5 decoders. I said, how'd you get those? Well, he wasn't too articulate. He didn't answer me, grabbed me by the arm and hauled me down to the kitchen and opened up the cabinets above the sink, and there, eureka! There were hundreds of them, thousands of them, box tops. There was Ralston, there was Wheaties, there were Ovaltine. As far as the eye could see, he said, here. And he took a big bag, a big shopping bag, and began to scoop them in there by the dozens. He said, take all you want. I got 5 brothers, that's all we eat. Well, I took them, I went home, the first thing I did was send for a decoder. And when I finally got the decoder, I got it, and I went into the bathroom to decode the first message. I didn't want anybody to hear it, and it said, eat your Wheaties. That's what it said. But life went on. Anyway, that's life from the bottom with the WPA. Well, the WPA may have spawned a do-good culture, which often left in its wake social ostracism and an underclass. It also gave birth to a unique cultural experiment called Federal One. The work relief program for the arts, also known as Federal One, was regrettably short-lived and often misunderstood. As a result, it eventually became the whipping boy for conservatives in Congress, such as Martin Dies and J. Parnell Thomas, particularly after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939, August of 39. Eventually, it became the whipping boy in the late 30s and early 40s of men like Joseph McCarthy and Roy Cohn. But during its short tenure, it gave us a remarkable outburst of government-supported creativity, hitherto unknown in this or any other country. Well, why Federal One? FDR was not an intellectual. He was not a deep thinker, but he was a patrician who was imbued with a fine appreciation for the values essential to the good life. And these values included fine music, fine art, good theater. By 1935, FDR had become the quintessential paternalist of our struggling democracy. He relished the role and wanted to make the essentials of the good life available to masses of his people. Harry Hopkins, who FDR chose to head up the WPA program, had led the president's relief efforts in New York State, when FDR had been the governor of New York. Many felt that Hopkins was FDR's chosen successor. Unfortunately, he died prematurely. But he was a complex guy, very complex guy, born out west, but he was pale and ascetic, anything but a Western type. Came east early in his career, went to Grinnell College in Iowa, and came east, had an experience with interning at a settlement house in New York City, and then and there decided to devote the rest of his life to social work, both private and governmental. Hopkins was driven by a moral imperative, an intense desire to help others that would have pleased even Immanuel Kant. It was a quality that resonated with FDR. And Hopkins, backed by Roosevelt, carried this moral intensity into his work as WPA administrator. Yet Hopkins was, of course, anything but puritanical. He was a fixture at the racetrack in Washington, gambled often, had no formal religious affiliation. But the unique combination of FDR's patrician paternalism and Hopkins' moral passion was no doubt the prime driving force behind the creation and implementation of Federal One. As Robert McIlvaine conjectured, FDR and Hopkins saw in Federal One a, quote, grand opportunity to fuse high culture with American democracy, end quote. Harry Hopkins was among those who thought it was foolish, wasteful, to put a concert violinist to work laying bricks or a Shakespearean actor. In centuries past, talented artists required the patronage of the wealthy, and those that didn't have it often died in obscurity, to wit, Mozart, buried in an unmarked grave. Now, under FDR and Hopkins, the federal government became the ubiquitous patron of the arts, and during its short but intense life, the Federal One gave millions of Americans their first opportunity to experience cultural heights previously reserved to the rich, the well-born, and the able. Well, one of the Federal One's programs, the Federal Theater Project, gave birth to the careers of some of our great actors, directors, writers, among them Orson Welles. When I gave this course at Williams, most of the kids didn't recognize these names. I hope you will. Orson Welles, Arthur Miller, okay, John Huston, Joseph Cotton, E.G. Marshall. Remember? Arlene Francis, Howard Da Silva, a name from the past. Burt Lancaster, who started out, incidentally, as a clown, an aerialist in an FTP circus, a Federal Theater Project circus. Canada Lee, remember him? John Houseman of Paper Chase fame. All of them. WPA-sponsored amateur theaters sprung up and flourished all over the country. One of them, called the Cleveland Theater for the Youth, held forth in a rickety old converted garage building on the shores of Lake Erie. It had been converted on a very, very slim budget in downtown Cleveland. The title Cleveland Theater for Youth was a misnomer. I acted in it, but I was 8 years old, and I was the only youth in the entire project. The play we gave was a play, coming-of-age play by Eugene O'Neill. Many of you may know it, called Wilderness. I played the 8-year-old brat brother. I remember that we acted in the dead of winter, and the chill, icy winds blew relentlessly off Lake Erie. Nothing to stop them from Canada, by the way, right into that rickety old converted garage in downtown Cleveland. It's always cold in that theater. I remember that the actors all wore turtleneck sweaters, and they would be huddled around this kerosene stove. And, you know, Marcel Proust once noted that our senses bring back memories more directly than our intellect. It's so true. I remember every time I smell kerosene, it takes me back immediately, instantly, to that theater on the shores of Lake Erie, and everybody huddling around that kerosene burner because it was so cold in that icy theater. Also, the first scene I vividly remember, the family was sitting around a dinner table. Families did that in those days. And they were eating lobsters. And so we had lobster shells. And after a while, they began to smell some. And I immediately, anytime I take the lobster shells out to the garbage, I immediately carry back to that scene in that theater in Cleveland. I remember peering out from behind the curtain with other members of the cast to see who's there from the audience. And the audience came, it was free, and even though it was freezing, the audience was there, and they were very interested in what we were doing. They were into what we were doing. When it was totally freezing cold, below zero outside, it'd be slightly smaller, but not much. There's more to the memory. I remember we gave 8 performances, and they had to write me out of the second act because it was past my bedtime. But the final show, the 8th one, I was allowed to come and take my bows with the rest of the cast after the second act. And standing out on stage front with the rest of the cast, I could, for the first time, fully absorb the enthusiasm of that audience. They were actually standing up and applauding. The audience, large or small, was always wildly enthusiastic. They clapped long and they clapped hard, and the cast heard them and clapped with them. It's the first time I'd ever witnessed that. It was a certain supportive togetherness that I saw there. A magnetism between that cast and the audience in that freezing converted garage on the shores of Lake Erie that I've never experienced either before or since. It was a moving thing, elevating, transcendent, really, in many ways. Something far beyond even the most extraordinary theatrical experience I've ever witnessed. I imagine we weren't alone. At the same time that I was performing with other amateurs in downtown Cleveland, another Federal One program was making great strides. Federal Arts Project, graphic arts, gave rise to some of the great artists of all time. You'll recognize their names: Ben Shahn, Jackson Pollock, William de Kooning. It also gave rise to 2 great muralists, one called Diego Rivera and Clement Orozco. Gave them an opportunity to vent their anger at the capitalist system, painting anti-capitalist murals in the most unlikely places. There's one in the San Francisco Stock Exchange Club. It's there to this day. One in the RCA building in Rockefeller Center, and one in the Dartmouth College Library, and it's still there too. Their art, however, was too far to the left for the conservatives in Congress, and charges of communism now began to echo through the halls of Congress. Some of the graphic art was not without its humor. Rockwell Kent, given a rather free rein by the WPA to painting mural on the side of the post office in Manhattan, surreptitiously painted a slogan advocating Puerto Rican independence into an obscure corner of the wall. Rockwell Kent was too clever by half. He painted it in Icelandic. It's eventually uncovered, painted out. The Federal Arts Program did not veer as far to the left, however, as the Federal Theater Project. The FTP had been given wide latitude by the administration, but its social outlook finally brought it down. Political opposition to the program could not be silenced even by the entreaties of FDR and Harry Hopkins. And the Dies Committee gained momentum following the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in August '39, it eventually brought the program down. The House Un-American Activities Committee, in a foreshadowing of what was to come under McCarthy in the late 40s, investigated the FTP under the guise of a larger exploration of, quote, un-American propaganda activities. Now, FDR and Hopkins had appointed Hallie Flanagan, who was formerly head of the Vassar College Experimental Theater Program, as head of the Theater Arts Program. And she sat through a couple of months worth of vituperative testimony before this committee. And finally, she got her chance to testify. While she was testifying, she happened to mention Christopher Marlowe, the 17th century writer. And one of her interrogators interrupted her and said, Miss Flanagan, this Christopher Marlowe, was he a member of the Communist Party of the United States? Poor Flanagan realized it was a tragedy and the program was doomed from that point on. The tragedy which Flanagan perceived was in microcosm the tragedy of the entire Federal One experiment. The Federal Theater Project was cut entirely by Congress in the 1939 Relief Appropriations Bill. FDR reluctantly signed the depleted appropriation. He had no choice. The remainder of the Federal One program struggled on until 1943 on increasingly limited budgets. Recently, this uplifting but short-lived Federal One program for the arts has begun to gain recognition as a major achievement of FDR's administration, but not merely because of its material contributions to the world of art. It did indeed provide artworks of all forms of great value, but far more significant, it provided hope where there was none. It uplifted the spirits of a depressed nation, and it brought about a certain togetherness, theretofore unknown. FDR and Harry Hopkins had sought to lead a desperate, depressed, often suicidal people to a wonderful cultural world beyond their material wants. In so doing, even only for an instant, their program offered to a shivering but ecstatic audience in a converted garage on the shores of Lake Erie, as well as to the actors on stage, a glimpse of a better, fuller life. Federal One had jump-started the imagination of a weary people. And it did so at a time when reality could offer many of them no end in sight to poverty, unemployment, starvation, disease, premature death. Finally, the summit gave a reason to strive and live, where previously there was only despair. Well, why was FDR able to create this rarest of government phenomenon? I spoke at the outset about a metamorphosis of soul. Now, that's a rather presumptive phrase. You may by this time be wondering what I had in mind. I've searched for a satisfactory definition of the word soul. There are 10 of them in the dictionary. None did the trick for me, but this did. It's by an author named Jacob Needleman in a book called The American Soul. Needleman defines soul as a deep, hidden power of consciousness and moral power within every human being, a force, an intensity of feeling and knowing that defines us as human beings, that defines our place in nature, on earth, and with each other. James Roosevelt had that. Eleanor Roosevelt would gain that. FDR was imbued with that. Prior to the onset of polio, FDR was a very lucky, very aristocratic, very handsome playboy. And he was considered by many as something of a lightweight. The Oyster Bay Roosevelt clan of Theodore Roosevelt in the early years often referred to Franklin Delano Roosevelt as Feather Duster. Oliver Wendell Holmes once characterized FDR as a second-rate intellect, but a first-rate temperament. Writer Elmer Davis had once described him as a man who thinks that the shortest distance between 2 points is not a straight line, but a corkscrew. John Maynard Keynes thought of him as an economic illiterate. But FDR emerged from his battle with death a changed man. He was still not an intellectual. In fact, outwardly he professed disdain for intellectuals, but he made good use of them in his brain trust. But he was transformed by his battle with polio. FDR emerged from his epiphany with a new intensity of feeling that fits Needleman's definition. It defined FDR. It defined his place in nature, on earth, and with other human beings. And this quality shined through The metamorphosis of soul of which I speak, therefore, is that of FDR himself. There's no other explanation as poignant for the man's connecting as he did with the populace. Consider this. Almost immediately after assuming office, FDR began a series of fireside chats. I've alluded to them before. Now, these were one-on-one radio broadcasts directly to the people on radio, and the only direct medium available at the time. And his broadcasts are estimated to have reached approximately 40% of our population. They reached my grandparents. I lived with them. I was just a very young witness, but I remember it as if it were yesterday. My grandparents lived in the same two-family house as we did, and I often spent much time with them. And they were built-in babysitters for me. I remember this, that when FDR would speak, they would sit glued to their 4-foot-high Philco radio. They heard every word, and what he said connected. But he connected over a great cultural divide. FDR was born in 1882 into an exclusive class of landed gentry in upstate New York. Grew up there on the banks of the Hudson and in Tony vacation spots such as Bad Nauheim in Germany, Campobello Island in New Brunswick. His clan was part of a sequestered Anglophilic Protestant club, clinging together in enclaves on the shores of the Hudson in upstate New York. My grandfather, born in the same year as FDR, 1882, but the similarity stops there. My grandfather grew up in a tiny little village in what is now known as Belarus, on the shores of the Dnieper River. It was called Strashin. There were no vacation spots, no Bad Nauheims, no Campobellos, in fact, no vacations. Nor did he travel much, except for Tsarist military service. He spent his youth within the confines of Strashin village. FDR was an accomplished sailor. Spent many long hours in and around Campobello Island in New Brunswick. It was a hobby which befitted his family's venerable station in life. My grandparents' only seagoing adventure was in steerage, from Hamburg and then Glasgow to New York in 1904, wearing destination tags. It was a bumpy ride. Many of their fellow passengers actually jumped overboard to their death before reaching Ellis Island. FDR, again as befitted his station, and following in the shadow of his uncle by marriage, Teddy Roosevelt, rose meteorically to become Assistant Secretary of the Navy in the Wilson administration. My grandfather's military experience was as a foot soldier in the army of the Tsar, into which he didn't volunteer but was begrudgingly dragooned for 4 long years, and escaped after his tenure of 4 years because he was fearful he would be dragged back in to fight in the Russo-Japanese War, and escaped by bribing the border guards. FDR never really had earned money. Believe it or not, he never had to support anyone. His mother supported him for the most part after his marriage, and even on into the time of his presidency. He was the beneficiary of trust funds. Upon completion of his term as Deputy Secretary of the Navy, he spent some time in the private sector as a lawyer and with a sinecure bestowed on him at the Fidelity Deposit and Trust Company in New York, but he never really paid a lot of attention to that, never involved himself too deeply in either activity. He was, first and foremost, a gentleman farmer and a politician. My grandfather, on the other hand, started a blue-collar business from scratch in Cleveland in the heart of the Rust Belt. He started out as a man with a carriage, with a wagon and a horse, went down to the flats of Cleveland along the Cuyahoga River, would get the used barrels from the various industries down there, would give them a very fair count for what he picked up, would bring them back to his barrel yard, recooper them, put new copper on them, and resell them. Doing that, he put 2 sons through medical school, and my mother through the School of Education at Western Reserve. They also took in boarders. There were no trust funds, no sinecures. FDR spoke the King's English, almost with a bit of an Oxford brogue, having spent considerable time as a youth in the baronial manor houses of many English friends. My grandparents spoke English as a second language, heavily accented, and their accents were far from those of Oxford or Cambridge, for that matter. And yet, there was a formidable connect. I've tried, but I can't yet fully explain the remarkable bridge that crossed this monumental cultural divide. There is certainly no explanation for it in plain logic, but FDR spoke to my grandparents, and he spoke to them directly. There was an intimacy and a warmth, a bonding, if you will, around that old Philco radio. The depth of it could not adequately be described in words or conveyed. This was the genius of FDR. This was the intensity of feeling that defines FDR. He spoke in conversational tones to them and not at them. He was not lecturing them, but he invited them to reason with him. And unlike other leaders who professed to feel their pain, he indeed did. Why? Perhaps in part because he had himself risen from the depths of despair in battle for life against a disease, a killer disease that threatened all of them, and they knew it. He spoke to them with a lilt in his voice. He asked the people in their desperation not to lose heart. Instead, he invited them to join him in a joyous adventure and to enlist every ounce of the American creative spirit within them to defeat the common enemy, fear. And through it all, in Raymond Moley's words, remember them? Roosevelt preserved the air of a man who'd found a happy way of life. His animus, his exhilaration, his bonhomie, these are things which were a welcome relief from the dour, puritanical sermons to which they'd been subjected during the final moribund years of Herbert Hoover. He was in effect asking them, FDR was, to share in the same uplift, the same metamorphosis of soul, if you were, that he himself experienced during his own epiphany in the 20s. This was the remarkable genius of Roosevelt. He bonded with the body politic directly through the only direct media then available, without intermediaries, without talking heads, without video replays, and he did it throughout America and across monumental cultural divides, such as those of my own grandparents. And he did it to a depth no other leader has either equaled or approached either before or since. And for that reason, the period in our history, 1933 to 1945, will no doubt forever remain, as one eminent historian has dubbed it, the age of Roosevelt. Thank you. Now, I know many of you have had experiences during the Roosevelt years, and maybe some of you would like to talk about them, but please feel free to raise your hand, and George over here will get the mic to you if any of you have anything, any comments on this period. Yes, there you are. Okay.
I think this description of Roosevelt as having a metamorphosis of soul says a great deal about those who describe Roosevelt as a traitor to his class.
Well, that's very interesting. He was, of course, so described, and I'll get into that next week. There was a famous cartoon in the New Yorker. Some fairly wealthy folks, obviously well-dressed, upper bourgeois people, saying to each other, well, let's get together and go down to the theater and hiss Roosevelt. He was deemed a traitor to his class by many of the people that he grew up with. I'll get into that next week with the discussion of the fact that he was denied entrance to a very exclusive club when he was at Harvard, and the effect it had on his life. But yes, that, quite frankly, as I will point out next week, had a significant effect on his life, and has significantly, in my judgment, enabled him, because he was a traitor to that class and was not fully tied into that class forever, to see far beyond what that class was able to see. And he was not basically striated within the social norms of that class. He was able to see things they would never see. Yeah, very, very astute point. That metamorphosis of soul enabled him to go beyond that. And that's a very critical point. Yeah, very good point.
I think you sort of glossed over the fact that Francis Perkins was the Secretary of Labor. I think that was one of the most important progresses, because women in those days could rarely get into law schools.
Yes.
So choosing a woman like that was phenomenal.
Yeah, absolutely correct. And I didn't mean to gloss over. She was quite a force, and she was a force in New York State before that, during his administration. Yes, he did some other remarkable things of that nature. He broke the mold. He broke the mold with Francis Perkins, of course, appointing a woman as Secretary of Labor. He broke the mold by appointing in 1939, 1940, when he was going to run for a third term. He appointed Frank Knox, believe it or not, as Secretary of the Treasury, a man who had run as the running mate of Alf Landon against him in '36. And he also appointed other Republicans to positions in his cabinet. Amazing that Henry Stimson, for example, he made him Secretary of War in his cabinet in 39 and 40. So he broke molds that way. He really marched to the beat of his own drum. And that's one of the things that Roosevelt did. So Francis Perkins, you're quite right. It was a major move on his part, one of the first women ever appointed to such a position in the cabinet. Yes.
How much of an influence do you think Eleanor had on the decision-making?
Enormous. I really think so. Now, of course, their conjugal relation stopped in 1919, I think it was, when she discovered the Lucy Mercer letters. And of course, the only reason that she stayed on was there was a pact between them, enforced on them really by Sarah Delano Roosevelt's mother, who was supporting them, to the effect that she would live apart from him conjugally, and she did for the rest of their lives. But a different relationship, a different partnership developed between them. She became a major factor in his life. Of course, when he got polio, when he was lame and couldn't walk at all, she became his eyes, his ears, and his legs. She went out she kept his reputation and his image alive during a time when he was totally bedridden. And so she kept his image alive and kept him that way in politics. Later on, she became the voice of his social conscience, an enormous voice in the White House. And there were times, as I point out, where he had to make life and death decisions, very tough decisions, difficult, sometimes wrong, but he had to make those decisions. She was always there, writing notes to him. She would leave notes on his pillow, basically, and he had to deal with them. Every night, she would leave something that she wanted and call to his attention things that otherwise would never have come to his attention. As a result of that, he did an enormous number of things that he never would have done. So I think she was an enormous influence on him as a partner, but not conjugally after 1919. Yes, in the back. George will be right up to you with, I want everybody to hear what you have to say. Yeah.
Was the CCC integrated?
Was it integrated?
Yeah.
Good question. I think so. I believe there were African Americans and others in the CCC. I don't think they discriminated against them, but I honestly don't know.
Segregated housing? Was it, I mean, how did it work?
Good question. I don't think they had segregated housing, no. I don't think they did, and I don't think they only took in whites. I think it was a program that took in a lot of inner city kids as well. But I don't know how well integrated it was at all aspects of it. Good question. I don't really know the answer.
Do you think it would work now?
Do I think what?
Do you think it would work now?
CCC now? That's an interesting question, isn't it? I don't know. It might. It might. In a sense, Obama tried to foster a number of public work projects, more like the WPA kind of projects, but giving major government money to the funding of highways and that sort of stuff, which is getting in order to try to jumpstart the economy. Would the CCC, would wilderness projects of that nature work at this particular time? Might. And as a matter of fact, what he's doing now might actually be a blend of the public works projects and the kinds of things the CCC got into at that time. So it's an interesting question. I think an interesting model to try to follow. It was something that worked, and it worked very well. The problem was, and Roosevelt understood that problem, that once people got into that, he didn't want them to become dependent upon it. He didn't want it to become the federal dole and to be a work relief project. He wanted people to get into it, get their dignity back, get some sustenance for their families, and then get out of it, find a way out of it. That's the major problem with these projects. They come and they're temporary. You build the road and it's finished. And then what do you do with all the people that are on it? The hope is that you'll jumpstart the economy, especially in the areas where they're working, and that will give rise to more jobs in the private sector. But it's an interesting question. Any other questions at this point? Yeah.
First, I wanted to tell you about your mother's sales experience with the bank.
Yes.
My mother Rose had the same experience.
Is that right? Wonderful.
And they sent her away, and she came back the next day. As she tells the story, it was all paid out in coin, so she had this big thing. I wanted to ask you,
Sure.
This is a period when fascism had come to Italy and was moving to Germany.
Yep.
It was a period of crisis.
Yep.
People at the top must have been fearful of this. You didn't reference how much of this fear of fascism or communism or socialism resonated in the halls when they contemplated what to do. And when Roosevelt held back, when Hoover asked him to come in, after all, he didn't get into office until March. How did that play?
Well, a number of questions there. First, the interregnum was a very, very difficult period from November to March, November 32 to March of 1933. And we've done away with that, thank goodness. Now the inauguration's now in January. It was a very difficult period, and Roosevelt has been severely criticized by many historians for his actions during that period, or non-action during that period. He would not cooperate with Hoover. Hoover pleaded with him to cooperate with Hoover, to join with Hoover in the bank moratoriums and what had to be done during that period, because banks were closing left and right. And between November 32 and March of 1933, many, many more banks closed, and things went from bad to worse. So Hoover was very dour when Roosevelt picked him up, and they went to they rode to the inauguration together. Very difficult period. Now, as to the oncoming of fascism, and I'm going to get into that rather significantly both next week when I go into the question of why he didn't cross the line to despotism, and I'll get into that the week after when we deal with the War of the Worlds as metaphor, and I'm going to go into the history of what was going on in Europe at the time. A significant effect on us here. The amazing thing to me is that the early years of Roosevelt's administration, as I pointed out, The word dictator did not have a negative meaning. Studebaker named a car the dictator, didn't discontinue it until 1937. Amazing. Mussolini was much admired as having brought the Italian economy back and made the trains run and so forth and so on. So fascism was not the major concern here. It began to be a concern as Hitler began to gain power. What began to happen? The odd thing that began to happen was that Hitler took power in January 30th, 1933, same time as Roosevelt. But significantly different things began to happen over Germany. He began to rearm almost from the start in contravention of the Versailles Treaty. In 1936, in 1934, he tried to invade Austria and Mussolini stopped him. First time he was stopped and he immediately withdrew. But in 1936, he marched into the Rhineland, demilitarized zone. He would have pulled out immediately had there been any resistance, but there wasn't any. And now it was beginning to become a fearful situation. 36, 37, now all of a sudden Italy invaded Ethiopia and other things began to happen. You got an Anschluss with Austria in 38. You got the Munich situation in 39. It was beginning to become a major concern, fascism. And the various things that Mussolini had instituted, which really divided or went in negative to the separation of powers, destroyed the separation of powers that we had so carefully guarded here, began to become of concern to our people. So that you find in 1938, 37, 38, when Roosevelt was trying to pack the court, then suddenly we're very concerned about the breakup, the possible breakdown of the separation of powers as they'd had in Germany. So what had happened in Germany when Hitler took power in January of 1933, he was elected by a majority. It was a small majority, like 33 or 34%, but it was enough to give a majority in the Reichstag, and he was appointed by Hindenburg. What began to happen after that, of course, was Hitler, having been placed into power, said, I'm never going to leave this post. Never going to leave this post. And you may remember there was the burning of the Reichstag that happened not long after that. And he used the burning of the Reichstag, which I'm sure was planned by the Nazis, to immediately obliterate the Reichstag and basically bring all the powers on an emergency basis. It never let up into his own self. We began to see that over here, but we didn't see it as vividly as we did when he began to become successful over there in 1936, and later on, more importantly, when he did the Anschluss with Austria, and when he went into Czechoslovakia and Munich. That's when we began to wake up to that. And we'll get to that when I talk about the War of the Worlds as metaphor in our fifth session. All that's coming. So I hope I'll see you back. Hope you're enjoying it, and we'll see you all next week.